Well, we'll get started here, and um, yeah, those who are co-hosts, if you could just keep letting people in as they appear, that would be wonderful. So welcome again. I guess we're on week 5 of this class,
Sure.
and so this week we will be discussing chapters 8 and 9 for Color of Compromise. So 8 was compromising with racism during the civil rights movement, and 9, organizing the religious right at the end of the 20th century. Um, I, I wanted to pause just for a moment before we move forward, and because I know that we're getting now to a point in this book um, where history is now something that at least some of us have lived
Right.
through.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that changes the conversation a little bit, and it changes our perceptions, and it changes our particular feelings. um, Things may well up in us that we maybe don't feel when we're talking about the time of the revolution, the founding of our country, even the Civil War. So I just want to acknowledge that, and start us off with a prayer practice called breath prayer, that you may or may not be familiar with it. It's very simple. I will say a short phrase and break it into two parts. In the first half, you'll just take a simple breath in, and the second half, you'll just exhale that breath. And we'll do that 2 or 3 times. And breath prayer is just a way to kind of get our bodies in prayer, rather than just maybe our minds or our words. Um, so let me start us off with this breath prayer. And the phrase will be, teach me your ways so I may walk in your paths. So we'll inhale on teach me your ways, and we'll exhale on so I may walk in your paths. So let's close our eyes as we engage in breath prayer together. Teach me your ways so I may walk in your paths. Teach me your ways so I may walk in your paths. Teach me your ways so I may walk in your paths. Holy Spirit, guide us. Jesus, be with us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so before we watch these 2 videos, or this first video, I just wanted to share some key terms for this first chapter, chapter 8. So I'm going to share my screen here. So just some key terms as we're talking about sort of the time of the era of civil rights and Martin Luther King Jr. So we have the Brown versus Board of Education. It's a 1954 landmark Supreme Court case that declared segregation in public schools illegal and paved the way for desegregation nationwide. Next one is The Head of Christ, which is a painting by Walter Salmon. And it's a painting that's reproduced 500 million times, depicting Jesus Christ with European figures, light skin, auburn hair, and blue eyes. And it reinforced this image of a white Jesus or a white Christ. And it's an image, as we'll see, we're all probably very familiar with. And last is a letter from a Birmingham jail. This is a letter in 1963 written by Martin Luther King Jr. It's a classic piece of political theology penned by Martin Luther King Jr., and it was in response to white clergy at the time urging moderation and patience in the civil rights movement. So those just a few key terms to acknowledge as we watch this first film clip. So let me get this going here. And, okay, here we go.
We've all heard the story of the tragic lynching of Emmett Till, right? But let me give you a little background to let you know just the humanity of this young boy. Emmett Till was 14 years old, and he begged his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, to let him go down to Mississippi from Chicago so that he could visit his cousins and get a break from city life. Now, his mother was reluctant, but eventually she relented. Unfortunately, it would be the last time that she saw her son alive. In August 1955, Emmett Till, along with his cousins and some friends, they're joking around and playing outside of Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi. We don't know exactly what happened, but Emmett Till went into the store and was alone with the store proprietor named Carolyn Bryant, and somehow he crossed an invisible line of Jim Crow. He either whistled or flirted with Carolyn Bryant, and when she told her husband about it, he was furious. He got his brother-in-law, and they went and they got Emmett Till from where he was staying with his grandfather, took him out to a secluded place, and proceeded to torture and eventually murder him. As far as Till's body, it was discovered in a river several days later. His ear was sliced, his femur was broken, he had a cracked skull and a bullet hole above his ear. It was a horrifying sight. And yet his mother decided to have an open casket so that the world could see what hatred had done to her baby. Rosa Parks had Emmett Till on her mind when she decided to disobey a white bus driver and keep her seat. Now listen, Rosa Parks was not this silent, passive woman who all of a sudden one day decided not to move on the bus. In fact, she had helped defend Recy Taylor, the black woman who had been gang raped in Alabama. She also had attended, Rosa Parks, the famed Highlander Folk School to get training in civil disobedience. So this incident on the bus actually fit into a long history of Rosa Parks's defiance, and that's a story told well by the historian Jean Theoharis. Now, in the midst of Rosa Parks's defiance on the bus, people were gathering and coalescing into a force to do a bus boycott, and they called a 26-year-old minister in his first pastorate. It was an able young preacher of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Birmingham, and his name was Martin Luther King Jr. A guy named Rufus Lewis nominated MLK for the position of president for the newly created Montgomery Improvement Association. And King, in response to the nomination, humbly said, "Well, if you think I can render some service, I will." And thus started the public career of one of America's most well-known activists. Now, in this section, I want to talk about the civil rights movement through the lens of Martin Luther King Jr. and Billy Graham. Now, I like this comparison because there are some similarities and some differences. So both MLK and Graham are Christians, they're both preachers, they both have large audience, they give copious amounts of speeches and sermons and writings that we can study now, and they're widely viewed as leaders of a broader movement. And so I don't hold up these individuals as these two great men because no one else matters, but because they're representative of a lot of attitudes and views of different people in the United States. When it comes to Billy Graham, he's an interesting case. He's not some foaming at the mouth racist. He's not putting on hoods and burning crosses. I'd characterize him as what MLK called a Christian moderate. So a lot of Christians, like Graham, didn't give their wholehearted support to the worst racists during the civil rights movement. But neither did they openly oppose racists or disagree with their objectives and views. In fact, precious few Christians actively participated in the civil rights movement. And those who did, they faced incredible obstacles from families, friends, and even fellow Christians. So at a key moment in the life of the nation, one that called for moral courage, the American church responded to much of the civil rights movement with passivity, indifference, or even outright opposition. One of the biggest incidents in the civil rights movement was Brown v. Board of Education. It was a legal ruling in 1954, and it centered on 9-year-old Linda Brown. She became the focal point of this case that would overturn decades of legalized Jim Crow enshrined in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. Linda Brown's father wanted her to attend a better school, and that school happened to be white. This case that Brown's father made against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, combined with 4 others to become the Brown v. Board case. Now, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brown, and the Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren, said, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." So Brown v. Board effectively removed the legal keystone that had propped up racial segregation in public spaces. And in doing so, it outraged segregationists, many of them Christians. Let me tell you about G.T. Gillespie. He was the president emeritus of Belhaven College, now university. He was a segregationist and opposed the Brown v. Board decision. And so he writes a sermon and address called A Christian View of Segregation. In it, he admitted this. He said, the Bible contains no clear mandate for or against segregation between the white and Negro races. In other words, he was saying the Bible doesn't say explicitly that races should never mix. So then he goes on to this natural law argument, and he says, bluebirds never mate with redbirds, doves never mate with blackbirds, nor mockingbirds with jays. Then he turns to the Bible. In the Old Testament, there are instructions for the Israelites not to mix diverse things, such as wool and linen. And what Gillespie's saying is that the same thing would apply to race mixing. Now, obviously, the Bible is not talking about racial integration or segregation here, but these are some of the ways that Christians justified segregation in the name of the Bible. There was another minister named Carey L. Daniel. He even wrote a sermon called God, the Original Segregationist. So let's get back to Billy Graham. Now, Graham, in 1953, famously took down the ropes at one of his crusades that was dividing white and black attendees. And he said to the organizers, he said, either these ropes stay down or you can go on and have the revival without me. Now, this is a year before Brown v. Board. Then in 1957, Graham asked Martin Luther King Jr. to pray at and open one of his crusades, which he did. And yet, Billy Graham held back from really openly supporting the civil rights movement. He said things like, I believe the heart of the problem of race is in loving our neighbor. That sounds great. The problem is that Billy Graham and other white evangelicals only focused on conversion, and they saw any issues of social action like the civil rights movement as a distraction from the quote-unquote gospel. Now, this is interesting because Billy Graham and other white evangelicals were quite vocal on other issues that were political, such as communism or prayer in schools or the Bible in schools. But when it came to race, Graham's clear objective was on evangelism over social impact. The number of people who spoke prophetically against segregation and racism during the civil rights movement should not be overestimated. In reality, it was a very small minority of Christians who were doing the marches and the boycotts and actively participating in the civil rights movement. And Christian moderates were complicit in racism more often than courageously confronting it. Martin Luther King Jr. writes about this concept of the Christian moderate in his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail in 1963. So 1963 is an eventful year. That's the same year as the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. It's the same year as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And in April, on the 12th, in 1963, it was Good Friday. MLK was arrested for protesting in Birmingham, and that's when he wrote this famous letter from jail. Birmingham was a very dangerous place. It had earned the nickname Bombingham, and they had this famously segregationist law enforcement officer named Bull Connor, who wasn't going to let any outside agitators come in and disrupt the law that he thought should be in place. So in light of this, Martin Luther King told his allies in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as they were about to go into Birmingham for this campaign, he said, I have to tell you that in my judgment, some people sitting here today will not come back alive from this campaign. And I want you to think about it. So King knew he was going to a very dangerous place. He thought his life and those of the people who were with him might also be in danger. Now, we often talk about the letter from a Birmingham jail, but we don't often mention the letter to a Birmingham jail. In other words, the letter to which King was responding when he wrote his own message. This was a letter written by white clergy. They were pastors and there was one Jewish rabbi. What stands out to me about this letter is the reasonableness of it all. Again, these are not the outright foaming at the mouth racists. They said things in this letter like, "We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we're convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely." They go on to say that when rights are consistently denied, a case should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. So what are they saying? They're not saying, look, Martin Luther King and all these civil rights folks, you got it wrong. Things are just fine. Stay out of it. These moderate white clergy members are saying, listen, we get it. Society is unequal based on race, and you should do something about it, but you should do something about it in the courts. You should have patience. You should realize that things are slow to change. And so they're counseling moderation. Sounds all well and good, right? Well, what was King's response? In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he said this: "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." But guess what? It wasn't just white people who were Christian moderates. Sometimes black people played the role of Christian moderate as well. Joseph H. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention, the largest black Protestant denomination, and that was what King was a part of. Now, Joseph H. Jackson was not under any illusions about the racial status quo in America, but he absolutely hated the direct action techniques of the civil rights movement and often criticized Martin Luther King Jr., so much so that King and several other ministers left the NBC to form the PNBC, or the Progressive National Baptist Convention. One of the main differences between Martin Luther King Jr. and those who followed him, and Billy Graham and those who followed him, was the emphasis on laws and policies. And so King and other civil rights activists saw the need to change the laws of the land. That's why they celebrated things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, this was a very hard-won piece of legislation. It only passed in the wake of President John F. Kennedy's assassination, the March on Washington, the Freedom Summer of 1964, and King's response was positive. He said that the Civil Rights Act would bring practical relief to the Negro in the South and will give the Negro in the North a psychological boost that he sorely needs. Again, King and other Christians saw the need for changing laws, policies, and institutions. Graham and Christian moderates, on the other hand, had a more subdued stance. You see, they thought change came best through personal conversion and that people shouldn't get too distracted by trying to change laws. The Christian moderate may not have objected to the broader principles of racial equality, but they only offered tepid support and, at times, outright skepticism of the civil rights movement. The urban uprisings that happened in the 1960s form a very illustrative contrast to the ways that Graham and folks like King responded. And so when the Watts uprising happened in 1965 in Los Angeles, California, it was devastating. 30 people killed, millions of dollars in damages, and the entire country was looking at Watts and wondering what's going on. Now, MLK, he went there and he said, "I think we've got to understand that a riot is the language of the unheard." In other words, he wasn't condoning the property destruction or the death, but he was saying that what's happening there is indicative of a deeper sense of unrest among people of African descent and in the inner city in particular. By contrast, Billy Graham preached a sermon called Rioting or Righteousness. And in it, he said, "There is no doubt that the rioting, looting, and crime in America have reached a point of anarchy." The response that Graham and others had to urban uprisings led to this language of law and order that's going to come into play later on. Now let's talk about the Black Power movement and Black alternatives to Christianity. You know, what's interesting to me is that evangelicals place a priority on preaching the good news and conversion. That's what euangelion, evangelical, means, good news. And so the idea is that you share the good news and you would persuade people to become Christians themselves. But complicity with racism leads people away from Christianity and not toward it. In 1966, the term Black Power comes to be popularized. It taps into this rising sentiment among Black people who wanted more independence, more self-determination, and not focus simply on integration. As they looked at Christianity, it simply seemed like the white man's religion. And so there were religious alternatives to Christianity that some Black people said was more accommodating and more egalitarian in terms of its racial understanding. One of those alternatives was the Nation of Islam. It had some famous adherents, probably most famously Malcolm X, but also Muhammad Ali was a member of the Nation of Islam. But do you know how Ali became attracted to the Nation of Islam? Someone was handing out a newspaper of the NOI, and in it, it showed a cartoon depicting a white slave owner whipping an enslaved Black man while also telling that enslaved Black man to pray to Christ. The cartoon awakened Ali, and he realized that he hadn't chosen Christianity. He hadn't chosen the name Cassius Clay. So why did he need to keep these vestiges of slavery? So one reason we need to fight Christian complicity and racism is because it actually hinders the spread of the message of Jesus Christ among people of color and their allies. So what are the Christians who never made the headlines? I mean, we've been talking about Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr., these very famous people of the late 20th century. What about the folks who just went to church every Sunday, maybe made the midweek service? They were nice people. Their ambition was to have a good job and take care of their families. Well, I would say everyday white Christians were still complicit in racism as well. In his book, White Flight, historian Kevin Kruse talks about some of the ways that Christians practiced everyday segregation and racism. So Christians were complicit in housing segregation. There was a movement in Atlanta, Georgia that said, "Please help us keep our neighborhood white and preserve our churches and homes." It wasn't just housing segregation either. Schools also played a part in Christian complicity with racism. So many white flight schools, or as they're sometimes called, segregation academies, used the word Christian or church in the name. In other words, there were a lot of Christians participating in the growth of these schools, which, if you look back, many of them came into being in the late 1960s and early 1970s when the federal government got more serious about enforcing Brown versus the Board of Education and ensuring racial integration in the nation's public schools. There was a report in 1972 that said individual Protestant churches in most cities have participated and often led the private school movement during desegregation. Another example of the everyday complicity of everyday Christians in racism comes from historian Timothy Tyson in his book, Blood Done Signed My Name. Tyson's father was a minister in North Carolina, and he faced backlash for his progressive views on race. In one instance, Tyson's father, this white minister, invited Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, a very famous Black preacher, to his church, his white church, to preach. And it resulted in a protest meeting from the congregants and even death threats to Tyson's father if he allowed this Black man to preach at the church. Now, ultimately, Proctor did preach at the church, and he's such a good preacher and such a nice guy that eventually the congregation came to accept him and were glad that he was there. But that came not without controversy and conflict. Let me give you another example. Paul Harvey and Edward J. Bloom wrote a book called The Color of Christ, and they talk about the image of Jesus as this European looking white man. There's a famous picture of Jesus. It's called The Head of Christ, and it's by an artist named Warner Salman. It's Jesus with this long flowing brown hair. He's got this very light-skinned complexion, this long narrow nose and thin lips and blue eyes. It's quite the opposite picture of what Jesus probably looked like, which is a brown-skinned Middle Eastern man. Now, these images of this European or white-looking Jesus were found all over the place. In fact, in the 16th Street Birmingham bombing, there was that one stained glass window that was left intact. Well, Jesus in that image looked European. And this is a black church. What the authors of The Color of Christ say is that fashioning Jesus into a particular and visualized body made it impossible for any universal savior to rise above these racial conflicts. What they're saying, in effect, is how can a white Jesus be on the side of black people? For many black Christians, seeing these visual depictions of Jesus only further perpetuated the myth that Christianity is for the white man. Let me say one final word about Martin Luther King Jr. and evangelicals. You see, MLK has become sanitized, or as I often say, he's become the quotable king. We like the pithy phrases and the words about being judged by the color of one's skin and not the content of one's character. And we basically, in our day, have made King out to be less radical than he actually was. In fact, when he died, a majority of American citizens disapproved of him and his tactics in polls that were taken at the time. And we should also remember that King didn't die. He was killed. We often forget how controversial King was to evangelicals while he was alive. So in 1961, King gets invited to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. This is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention. One historian writes that within the church, this simple invitation was a racial and theological heresy, such that churches across the South rescinded their regular donations to the seminary. When donors heard that King was coming to their white evangelical seminary, they said, "We're taking our money back." Why? Because of King's emphasis on the social dimensions of Christianity. It put him at odds with and angered many white evangelicals of his day. Even Graham advised King in the early 1960s that he should, quote, "put on the brakes with all this civil rights stuff." Graham said the evangelist is not primarily a social reformer, a temperance lecturer, or a moralizer. He is simply a charis, a Greek word for a proclaimer of the good news. Again, this division between social and political realities and the so-called gospel, and never the twain shall meet. Graham had this very complicated backstory with race and racism. So for instance, he kept membership at First Baptist Dallas under the notoriously racist pastorate of W.A. Criswell. Criswell said, "Desegregation is a denial of all that we believe in." And when he was reflecting on Brown v. Board, he said it was foolishness and idiocy. I'll close with one final example of the way Christian complicity with racism can harm and hurt Black people in a way that they remember even decades later. In the late 1960s, one of the first 2 Black students at what is now called the Masters University in California played on a basketball team, and he was a good student. His name was Dolphus Weary. On the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he recalls in a book that he could hear voices down the hall of his classmates let out a cheer. Reflecting on his classmates' response, his white classmates' response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Dolphus Weary said, "Laughing at Dr. King's death was just like laughing at me, or at the millions of other Blacks for whom King labored. Not everyone was a virulent racist, but enough people went along with the status quo to make the civil rights movement both necessary and dangerous for those who participated." The American church largely chose to compromise with racism through a passive complicity. And so they rejected yet another opportunity to come alongside Black people in the nation's second Reconstruction, known as the Civil Rights Movement.
Okay. So just a few questions after watching that and pondering some of the stories that Jamar shared. Um, so the first one is about just in general the civil rights movement and that period of history. We as Jamar said, we often have this sort of romanticized view of that period and its figures like MLK Jr. Um, and even folks like Billy Graham. Um, but now that you've heard this story told from a different angle, um, what are some of the lessons that you took from that, or that you think you will take from that hearing that history told from this angle? Yeah, Joe Norton.
Well, I was thinking, kind of, I don't know if two-face is the right word for the way things were being preached back then, but really, when you stop and think about it today, I mean, these people that are calling themselves Christians have the same kind of segregatory beliefs and racist views of early back then. It's really kind of scary to think, we've talked about it, had movements and things since the 1960s, but it just made me think, gosh, especially after the January 6th, when you saw people who were, quote, Christians, doing such awful things, and the bit with Charlottesville, that it's still more present than would like to think it is, and that's kind of, it's heartbreaking to me.
Mm. Yeah, recognizing similarities to today is difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very.
absolutely. Andy Husband, saw your hand up.
Well, I think that he made a really profound statement about how some African Americans have been driven away from the church by the church's complicity with racism, or just unwillingness to say anything about it. We're actually hurting our own ability to reach out to people and bring them in. That people like Muhammad Ali wouldn't have been attracted to Islam if if the church wasn't engaging in racist behavior. And there's similar stories too. This isn't exactly the same thing, but imperialism around the world. Didn't Gandhi say something like he attended a Christian service and thought, well, I'd be a Christian if I ever met one? I feel like that's a pattern that comes up a lot. So there's something for us to reflect on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way our witness has not always matched our words, for sure. Yeah. Margie Herbert.
I think that it's such a challenge to try to separate following Christian calling and the culture that you're embedded in. And that I'm reminded of the predominant number of Christians in Nazi Germany who ascribed to Hitler's Nazism and supported that very enthusiastically. And that the complicity of the church and racist policies here in some ways comes as no surprise, because trying to understand how maybe as Christians we have to stand over against the culture at times and listen to prophetic voices rather than live an easy, comfortable life of kind of personalist Christianity.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna do one more before I move into the next question. So I saw Ernie, your hand up was up next.
Okay, I just wanted to build on what's been said. by pointing out that our racism here, we have exported, I think it has blunted the Christian message in other parts of the world. One short story, I'll try and keep it very short. We were living and working in Nigeria in the early 60s, the period we're talking about here, in a part of the country where there was a large number of Southern Baptist missionaries who, you know, we all envied them because they all had Mercedes with air conditioning. Most of us were driving around in VWs with the windows open. But I often wondered about how much their actions betrayed their message. One day I happened to be in Ibadan, huge city, and went for lunch at a restaurant near the consulate. And here it was full of white Southern Baptists having their annual meeting. The only person of color in sight were the waiters. And that's always stuck in my head is what message were they conveying to the African people? And this in an area of Africa at the time, which is very much in competition between Islamic missionaries and Christian missionaries. And that, you know, this group of missionaries clearly made their racial understanding very evident to the Africans.
Yeah, absolutely. And even within the PCUSA, and I don't know if other denominations have done this, but has made a shift in which you've probably noticed in what we call our missionaries, that it's shifted from missionaries to mission coworkers.
Right.
And it doesn't fix everything, obviously, but it's a shift to, we're not going into, you know, missionaries had this colonizing kind of sense behind it, but when you go in as a coworker, you're working with and alongside, and there's something very different. And like I said, not perfect certainly, but yeah, there's a different approach to that. I'll ask one more question before we move on to the next video. And I'm sorry I'm cutting this short. These two, I don't know if they're the longest videos in the series, but the first one was 25 minutes. So I wanted to reference the letter that King wrote from the letter from a Birmingham jail by referencing a call for unity, which was the letter that he received from white clergy and faith leaders. And if you remember, that letter was not saying that racism didn't exist and things were okay, but to say, you know, I think you need to do this with a little more patience, a little more slow. Maybe you need to, we think you need to use some different tactics. So with that letter in mind and that call from those white clergy and faith leaders, in what ways do you think similar rhetoric or tactics are used in conversations around racial justice today? Yeah, Susan Kelly.
I find it interesting to think about the verbiage that we're using when we talk about racism. Sort of new, less provoking words like white supremacy. Well, another way to say that would be, I read an article that said, gee, you could say whites receiving inherited privilege that they didn't earn, but got through, you know, the history of the way the world went. Or white fragility, where something like the story of Emmett Till really shakes white people up. And so we call it white fragility. But yet the flip side is that we didn't live in black skin and experience it. So there just seems to be a little bit of frosting over still, even though we're trying so hard to understand and feel and see history. There's a message to me about, look at what we're doing today. We still have maybe work to do within our hearts of being even more honest. I hope that makes sense, because for me, as I grew up, I graduated high school in Philadelphia in 1969, and I remember sitting at Sunday dinners where, you know, terrible things were said, like, gee, after the burning of Watts, well, let them all kill each other. You know, that stuff was around, and I was part of it. I was young and, you know, have all sorts of reasons why I didn't react, but it's still there, and it's part of my cumulative reality. So I'm trying not to get too whitewashy about it and say, you know, oh, take it to the courts, let's be temperate, but yet stay open-minded and compassionate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Don Thompson, I saw your hand up next.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was kind of an eyewitness to all this stuff, which says that I'm old. And it's kind of interesting. I think there's two things that come into play if I look back. One is that we're afraid of what we don't know.
Hmm.
If we're not associated with this stuff, we're afraid of it by default. And secondly is, if it doesn't affect me, I'm not sure how interested I'm going to be. And that happened to me until as a freshman at Penn State. There was this really cute girl that wanted me to go to a lecture. And I didn't care about the lecture, but I really cared about getting to know the girl. So I went to the lecture, and the speaker was Dr. Martin Luther King. And I sat there, a reluctant person in a 7,000 seat, hard benched gymnasium, didn't want to be there any more than fly in the air. And by the time I left, the man had me in the palm of his hand. The persuasive ability and the skill of explaining the problem, which I had never paid any attention to, was absolutely phenomenal. So I think that those of us that led the kind of life I did, we were afraid, and it didn't affect us, so we just didn't care.
Thank you for sharing that, Don. One more, I see Carolyn Dennis with her hand up.
Yeah, one of the things that just struck me is another book that I had read called White Too Long, and they did a study of churches and our attitudes towards racism. And one of the questions, a lot of the questions they asked were the very subtle things that you would never have really thought of as being racist. And one of them that just came to my mind was they asked, you know, why aren't Black people as successful as white people? And most of us said, because they don't work hard enough. You know, nothing to do with they don't have the same opportunities as we've had. And I can remember when I myself was in Sunday school way back in, I was probably 10 years old, let's say in the late 1950s. And our teacher was talking about race relations, and she told us about a study that they had done, I think it was a scientific study, I've heard of it since, but they had studied little children and found that little children were pretty much the same until they got to be about five years old. And at that point, the little white children were much more successful than the little Black children. And we, as Christians, should always be kind, but we should always remember that this is a God-given difference.
Mm.
And I got myself into big trouble there because I raised my hand and I said, but that doesn't allow for how different their opportunities have been. They haven't had the same opportunities as we've had. Well, all of a sudden the next week we had a different teacher who put me in my place very firmly and not really very nicely. But I just realized how we didn't call it racism. We were very kind, but it was there.
Yeah, the reasoned rhetoric, yeah, absolutely is Jamar talked about, sort of a trait of that. Yeah. So before we move on to the next video, I quickly wanted to share a quote with you from author, writer James Baldwin, which many of you are probably familiar with. But he wrote this or said this in the Dick Cavett show in 1968. He said, "I don't know what most white people feel in this country. I can only conclude what they feel by the state of their institutions." And if I highly recommend you go look that up on YouTube. It's a great little interaction with him and Dick Cavett. But I think it captures a little bit of what we're getting into this week of, the rhetoric of, oh yeah, of course we love our neighbor. But then when it comes to our institutions and laws and the way just our the world is set up, it looks very different. So I just thought, and James Baldwin was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and he kind of moved among many of these figures in the civil rights era. A few terms just to remember as we watch this next clip. So there's colorblind conservatism, a style of politics popularized in the 1960s that did not require overtly racist terms in order to enact policies that created and perpetuated racial inequities. The religious right, a broad coalition of religiously, socially, and politically conservative Christians that sought to lobby government officials for the promotion of so-called family values and Christian morality. The Southern strategy, a political tactic that used fears of the Black civil rights movement to galvanize an emerging sense of white middle-class suburban identity and garner votes for the Republican Party. And finally, the Moral Majority, a Christian political organization founded by Jerry Falwell, who described their values as pro-life, pro-family, pro-moral, and pro-America. So just some terms we'll be hearing. Let me share. We'll watch the next video here. Hold on just a second.
Political operative Lee Atwater said he had two great aims in life: to manage a presidential campaign and to be the chairman of his party. He achieved both of those goals by the age of 40. He was a Republican operative who worked on George H.W. Bush's campaign and earlier had worked in the Reagan White House as an advisor. He was known for his shrewd tactics and sometimes brutal political ad campaigns. But he made an admission. Shortly before his untimely death in 1991, because of a brain tumor, he said, "You start out in 1954 saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract." Atwater went on to explain, now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all the things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is Black people get hurt worse than whites. What Lee Atwater is encompassing in those statements is the idea of colorblind conservatism. One of the themes as we study U.S. race and racism is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. So in colorblind conservatism, You don't use explicitly race-based language. You claim that you don't see color, so you don't say black or white in the laws. But you still end up supporting social and political policies that adversely harm racial and ethnic minorities. This section, I want to talk about the rise of the so-called religious right. We're covering the period from the 1960s through the 1980s, and it's a time when political conservatives helped coalesce certain Christians into a political force that every major Republican political official had to court if they wanted to have lasting success. Now, neither Democrats nor the GOP adequately address racism. Neither party is free from it, but one party has set itself up as the party for, quote, real Christians and evangelicals. Now, let me say this from the outset. I thought in my experience that talking about racism would be the most controversial thing I could do among evangelicals, but I was wrong. It's talking about politics and racism. And so let me say from the start that this is not about anyone becoming a Democrat or a Republican or switching parties. I think we need faithful Christians in both parties, but we need faithful Christians being Christian where they are, which means calling out the bigotry and racism and prejudice that may arise from whomever or whichever party. Now, when we're talking about the rise of the religious right, politics became a proxy for racial conflict. And that conflict translated into divisions in the church. In the late 20th century, evangelicalism becomes a national movement. So in 1976, a Newsweek article proclaimed it the year of the evangelical. It's about this time that Jimmy Carter becomes the first openly born-again president. It's 1980 that Rick Warren establishes Saddleback Church as one of the first and premier mega churches in the U.S. It's the popularity of Hal Lindsey's book on the end times called The Late Great Planet Earth, which sold 28 million copies. What is an evangelical? Now, historians have spilled plenty of ink trying to tackle this question and define evangelicalism. One frequent reference point, which has its drawbacks but is helpful to start, is called Bebbington's quadrilateral, meaning four sides. The first is conversionism. Evangelicals place an emphasis on a personal decision to follow Jesus. The second is biblicism, which interprets miracles as true and scripture as divinely inspired. It's a supernatural book. The third is crucicentrism, which is a focus on the crucifixion and Christ's sacrifice. And then number four is activism, which means an engaged faith, one that doesn't retreat from the world, but somehow speaks to it. Now, there's something called the politicization of evangelicalism, this melding of evangelical Christian beliefs and politics. Historian Kristin Du Mez says, it seems reasonable to assume that when Americans self-identify as evangelicals today, many of them are identifying with the movement as it has taken shape in recent decades, a conservative, politicized movement. So we got to look, we got to probe this connection between evangelicalism and politics. Again, racism never goes away, it just adapts. Racism didn't end with the Civil Rights Movement or with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Fair Housing Act of 1968. 400 years of oppression and white supremacy does not disappear with the stroke of a pen or the passage of just a few years. Now, racism was easier to detect in the past. So this is one of the things that we have to be conscious of. Racism in the 21st century and even at the end of the 20th century, it's more subtle. But still, as subtle as it may be, Christian complicity remains. So we have to think about the role of white theological conservatives when it comes to the Republican Party. This is not an argument to switch parties or to say one party is better than another, but there is one particular party that has portrayed itself as the party that is friendly to white evangelicals. And within these parties, we need to be courageous about confronting racism wherever it may appear. In another segment, we talked about law and order politics. Billy Graham and the urban uprising and this rhetoric around keeping the order and people following the laws in opposition to urban uprisings, which were in many ways breaking the laws, but doing so, as King said, as a language of the unheard. Now, one of the politicians who popularized law and order politics was Richard Nixon. Billy Graham and Richard Nixon became fast friends. In one letter from Graham to Nixon, he said, anytime you have a few days this winter, we can take a swim or go play a game of golf in Florida, or better still, in Hawaii. Now, Graham had been affiliated with presidents throughout his career, but he was close friends with Nixon. Graham even gave Nixon advice on when Nixon was deciding whether to run for president, and said, listen, if you don't, you'll always wonder if you could have won. And so he did. Nixon ran and he won. And in his first election, he won 68% of the white evangelical vote. In his re-election, he won 84% of the white evangelical vote. Now, what is the appeal? It came partly from this idea of law and order politics. Again, it's a response to uprisings in urban areas. It's a response to the Black Power movement, which is advocating for more self-determination and independence among Black people. He said that the seeds of anarchy were nurtured by scores of respected Americans, including public officials, educators, clergymen, and civil rights leaders as well. He went on to say, I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States. Law and order rhetoric fueled an increasingly punitive criminal justice system, so that nowadays people talk about the crisis of mass incarceration. Think about this. The US has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its incarcerated persons. There are harsher sentences. There are undercover police squads that go in and raid inner city communities. There are financial incentives to building prisons. This is all part of what some historians have called the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy tapped into an emerging sense of white middle-class suburban identity. There was this, as Nixon said, great silent majority of Americans who were sick of the rioting and of the social upheaval of the civil rights movement. And so the Southern Strategy focused on mobilizing white people, not just in the South, but in the Sun Belt. What is the Sun Belt? It's an area that stretches across the United States in cities like Dallas and Orange County, California, Phoenix, Arizona, and many other places. It's a sense of identity as much as it is a geographic place. Fiscally and socially conservative voters, the type that might be attracted to folks like George Wallace in 1968, who ran for president. They focus on ideals like free market capitalism, meritocratic individualism, and the idea of America as a Christian nation. So when Graham first came to prominence early on in the 1950s in his crusades, he gave a sermon in California, and he said, I feel more at home here than any place I've ever been. Now, Graham is from North Carolina, but he's in California and feels at home because of this ethos of the Sun Belt. Now, this all sort of coalesces when Nixon runs for president. It's the first time that Billy Graham ever endorses a person as president in a campaign. And he tells Nixon, he says, evangelicals could promote the president's vision of law and order. There's that phrase again. H.R. Haldeman, a Nixon advisor, said, the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing so. That's how this phrase and this rhetoric of law and order functioned. It subtly imported a racist idea that black people were still really the problem, but it did so in a language that didn't use explicitly race-based language. Like I said, racism never goes away. It just adapts. All the American church really needs to do in terms of compromise is cooperate with already established racially unequal social systems. Nowadays, when people think of the religious right or organizations like the Moral Majority, the first thing people think about is abortion, that these are pro-life groups. And it seems like abortion was really the reason for being for all of these groups and the reason that all of these conservative Christians mobilized around a particular party. The reality, though, is that abortion was not the first unifying issue of the religious right. In fact, early on, theologically conservative Christians didn't necessarily have a very clear pro-life stance. W.A. Criswell, who's come up a few times in our talk about race in the American church, said, "I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had life separate from its mother that it became an individual person." The reality is that many Protestants saw abortion as mostly a Catholic issue and didn't take strong stances on it till late in the 20th century. So if it wasn't abortion that coalesced the religious right and the moral majority, then what was it? Well, to understand that, we have to look at Bob Jones University. This was a university started in 1927 under Bob Jones, who was a famous pastor and evangelist. Historian Randall Balmer looks at BJU and how the IRS cracked down on the university because the university prevented interracial dating. One of the officials at Bob Jones University said there are three basic races: Oriental, Caucasian, and Negroid. At Bob Jones University, everybody dates within those races, and anyone involved in an interracial relationship or who promoted such pairings would face expulsion. In view of their stances on race, the IRS revoked tax-exempt status in 1976, but Bob Jones University argued that segregation was a sincerely held religious belief and thus that the government was interfering with the practice of religion. It was only in 2008, the 21st century, that the university officially repudiated its stance. We conformed to the culture rather than providing a clear counterpoint to it. I appreciate this person's comments because he's speaking to the idea of complicity. Rather than countering the culture and the racist status quo of the university's previous presidents and the broader society at large, Bob Jones University, in many ways, went along with the culture in terms of compromise and complicity in racism. But the story of Bob Jones University doesn't end there. Paul Weyrich, a political analyst, said what galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, school prayer, or the Equal Rights Amendment. What changed their minds was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian school, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the basis of so-called de facto segregation. You see, many Christians saw what the IRS did in regard to Bob Jones University as the federal government coming after Christian schools and abridging their freedom of religion. And that is what Paul Weyrich and others have said is what originally coalesced the religious right and what eventually became an organization called the Moral Majority. One of the leaders of the Moral Majority is a man named Jerry Falwell. In the mid-1960s, he took a particular stance on the idea of pastors or Christians getting involved in civil rights. He preached a sermon called Ministers and Marches, in which he said preachers are not called to be politicians, but soul winners. Again and again in our study of U.S. history and race, we see this separation between the so-called gospel and the call to evangelize and convert people and social and political change. In other traditions, say the Black church tradition, those two have not been starkly separated, and people have seen it as part of the central core of the gospel to work for justice in the broader world. Now, that was in the 1960s when Falwell said this. By 1976, he had completely changed his tune. He was doing a tour called the I Love America Rally Tour, and it was the 4th of July, and in his message, he said this: "This idea of religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country." Quite the switch from what he said a scant 10 years or so before. Now, in 1979, Falwell forms the Moral Majority Incorporated. He does so in a meeting with other political and religious operatives, and he's trying to figure out how to gather a coalition of Christians that would form a political force for conservatism. And they chose the name Moral Majority. And in Falwell's words, it was pro-life, pro-family, pro-moral, and pro-America. This organization helped to formalize a shift that had been taking place for decades. Didn't create it, but it gave a framework for the politicization of evangelicalism. and included really not just evangelicals, but also Mormons, Jews, and Catholics. It grew. It had a $6 million budget within a couple of years. The Moral Majority Report, its institutional communication arm, went to 840,000 households. So it was very popular among a segment of the American society. The Moral Majority was also a strong supporter of President Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan is still today by many people seen as the epitome of the Republican Party and a hero among both political and Christian conservatives. At a rally at First Baptist Dallas, W.A. Criswell's church, in 1980, Ronald Reagan said, "I know this is a nonpartisan gathering." This is a room full of white evangelicals. And he said, "So I know you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing." Well, of course, evangelicals at this point fell in love with this man and his rhetoric and the sense that he was for them. He was for Christian America. He was for a white evangelical vision of America. So they voted for him in droves. When he was elected in November of 1980, Jerry Falwell, who was heading the Moral Majority, called it "my finest hour." So again, the point's not to push Christians toward any particular political party. The goal here is to probe how our political allegiances specifically impact race relations. The religious right compromised with racism by failing to support civil rights legislation and alternatively by supporting policies that adversely and disproportionately impacted Black people. There are these pernicious ideas in the political realm about welfare and welfare queens and crime that is focused among Black people, these ideas that lead to issues such as mass incarceration. There's also this issue that capitalism is somehow the only Christian way to think about economics. In fact, Jerry Falwell said in his book, Listen America, the free enterprise system is outlined in the book of Proverbs. Over time, Black people have voted less and less for Republican candidates or their policies, while white evangelical support remains strong. In fact, it's the highest of any religious demographic group. And we've got to probe that. We've got to ask, why are Black and white people generally and Black and white Christians in particular voting so differently? What is it about the platforms of each party that appeals so differently to these different groups along racial lines? There are always unintended consequences of our political choices, bad things that happen as a result of things that we did support. We can't completely plan for that, but Christians do have the responsibility to consider how our political allegiances attach themselves and either support or deny racial justice. In particular, we need to look at this marriage between evangelicalism and conservative politics, and the ways that particular policies may have, even inadvertently, supported racial inequality.
So I'm gonna ask one question, and then at 12:45, I'm gonna close with a prayer to give people, if you need to leave, a chance, sort of an out. And then I'll stick around for another 15 minutes or so if people want to continue conversations. But the question I wanted to ask you after watching that clip, dealing with it sort of as a whole, is, from your upbringing, as a child through adulthood and even through today, what has the church, sort of, large C church, directly or indirectly taught you about the relationship between faith and politics? As you look back sort of on your life from childhood up until today, what has the church directly or indirectly taught you about the relationship between faith and politics? Has it informed that? And I'm sorry, my kids are running above me, so if you hear banging, that is my children. Yeah, Jackie Steinmetz.
I had a very interesting situation. It's just a little bit of story and a little bit of answer to your question. In 1963, I was, my parents were going to an Episcopalian church, and I was in the process of joining that church. And in May of when we were supposed to join the church, my minister was in jail for protesting. And it was really divided our church. My parents really struggled with that. They did not want to continue with the church, and eventually he was, the minister had to leave the church. But it made an impression on me as a 13-year-old that I didn't like that. And I interestingly enough, I continued to go. I had to get a ride there, but I had to go. And I thought how that has changed me in my life. Again, answering your question a little bit, the church was involved. My church was involved with politics right then. And in an Archie Bunker sort of society where my parents were accepting and, you know, doing that, I chose to do something different. And my hope that my grandchildren now that are in teenagers and the kids that you work with, Chris, in youth group are more open. They're more understanding. They're more accepting. Sometimes, not always, but I think it's our responsibility as leaders of the church to bring those opportunities to them, to let them grow and understand and not be so closed in. And you guys doing a really good job with that, and I have hope. So
yeah, thanks for sharing, Jackie. Yeah, Betsy Ballantyne.
Hey, and I was told about finding that hand, and I can't find it so well. I raised my hand.
That's okay.
Hey, so I grew up on the main line at Went to Wayne Presbyterian Church. Just briefly, I was very conservative. Everybody I knew was Republican. My parents were Republican. I was the head of the Young Republicans in Radnor Township at one point, believe it or not. I mean, all of that. I was fortunate because Dick Sigler, who was one of our pastors there, had been very involved in the civil rights movement and had actually marched with Dr. King in one of the marches, and really influenced my entire adolescence because of all of a sudden questioning all of these things that he just spoke about on this video and in the book. We as a youth group really began to take more of a serious look about what our faith was saying and what our life was and our parents were saying. And that was a whole different thing. And of course, attending Penn State, during, Vietnam and all that stuff. I mean, everything changed. David and I had an entirely different viewpoint about an awful lot of stuff that wasn't, quote, mainstream. And I'm sure all of you have experiences like this. I think the biggest thing for me was when our daughter met Albert, who is my son-in-law. My father, who was, that staunch Republican, not a bad guy, believe me, not a bad guy, told us to break it up. It told me to break it up because he did not see that anything good was going to come from this relationship. It was going to be too difficult. And, it's like, I just said, Dad, what am I supposed to do about it? I mean, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stand against that or give her 75 reasons why this is not a good idea or try and make it so she can't see him or whatever. Well, subsequently, they married. Along comes Aiden, along comes Ben, and along comes Blake. My dad, because Albert was the guy he was, this is not being colorblind. Albert was raised the way he was. Albert was, he had been involved in the church. Now, let me tell you, he didn't do everything perfect. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, but he really, when they were first dating, formed a relationship with my dad, and my dad came to really, truly love him. And it was different because he met my dad on a personal level, and it wasn't just being Black or just being, you know, from a different culture. It was that meeting that Albert had with my dad, and so it all worked out in the end, I guess.
Yeah.
He never was alive to see my grandsons, which is a shame. But he was a good guy, and I think part of that meeting personally, forming this personal relationship is what Christ would have said to me. Everything that he said in this book is right on the money. I am so happy that we have been able to watch this and read this book and really examine ourselves. And I'll get off here because I'm talking too much, but there you go.
Thanks, Betsy. Last one, Nick, I saw your hand up, Tortorello.
Yeah, last night when I was reading the assignment, I stopped and said to myself, okay, so where do we go from here? Obviously, you know, Christianity has been complicit. But how do we make things better, and how do we improve our society going forward? And a couple of things really occurred to me. One, I still think Christianity is a big part of the answer. You know, we haven't done everything perfectly, certainly as institutions in the past. And that's Baldwin's point about institutions have their own needs to survive, and they have their own needs to raise money and to stay, you know, live and to still be able to speak to a lot of people. So institutions sometimes can complicate things. But if you take the Christian message, which is to love each other, the golden rule, treat each other like you want to be treated. In really bad situations, be able to turn the other cheek. I think that's a big part still of the answer, is each of us as individual Christians doing what we can do to better the world. Second, I think education is extremely important. This course is a real eye-opener. It's something that we didn't see maybe in our own personal lives or understood it well enough. But I still think education's a big thing. And I'll tell you personally, I went to a summer program at Yale University that was basically designed to get poor whites and Blacks into Ivy League colleges. And I had 2 Black roommates. Now, I had gone to a public high school where I was a minority, where Blacks were in the majority. But my father, who was a New York City cop, used to say to me, Blacks are fine, but you don't want to live with them. So that summer I had to live with them. I had 2 Black roommates, one from Meridian, Mississippi, and one from St. Louis. In St. Louis, you may not have thought about this, but it was a very racist city. And living with them that summer and hearing their wishes, their desires, their dreams, and their history, and their families, and they had both also had grandparents who were slaves, really changed my whole understanding. Because these were like almost having a new brother or sister, and hearing them and caring about them, it changed what was in my heart. Part of what was in my heart was my father being a New York City cop, and not definitely in some ways a racist, despite what his comment was. Those are the things you think are right because you don't know anything better, because your parents are raising you, you love your parents, they tell you things that are myths or misunderstandings that they have. And unless you have that separate experience of your own, like living with Black people, living with another minority group, you really don't know what the facts are. Otherwise, you're getting third-hand kind of recitations. And the third thing is you need to have shared experience. I have, since those days at Yale, tried to have Black friends. And I have had Black friends, and I still have Black friends. And I have a person now who I'd call a caregiver who's a Black. And having that relationship with Black people and hearing their needs and wants and their dreams and their hopes, it changes you in the process of you learning from them. You learn from them and they learn from you. And there's a real communion that goes on. So in terms of going forward, I still think Christianity, certainly as practiced by individuals, is important. Second thing is education. And the third thing is shared experience. I think if you can go through all those, hopefully you come out of it not being a racist and understanding why you have the beliefs and the values you do.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Nick. Like I said, I'm gonna end with a prayer and actually one other small thing. If you, because I saw a couple hands up, if you want to stay a little longer, I'll be on for another 10 or 15 minutes. Feel free to stick on. But one thing I wanted to, as we go, especially this week and the following week, I think it's, as this gets maybe a little bit more personal and closer to home, one of the things we need to be mindful of is the process that we're going through. Is this might be a little bit of deconstruction for some of us, where things we thought in the past are not what they actually are, or things that have shaped us and formed us. We recognize that maybe that was harmful or wrong or misguided, which I think this course is for many of us doing that. And so some of us, this may be the first time we're doing that. Some of us might be kind of already on that journey. Wherever you are, I think we've probably experienced some sense of some kind of grief. And if you know anything about grief, there's different stages of denial and anger and depression and bargaining and acceptance. And those, I think, come up as we learn more about this and about racial injustice, and especially when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our theology or the church. So I wanted, as we go on this week and we head into next week, and I encourage you to keep asking these questions to yourself beyond that, think about you personally. It's one thing to know things and to learn the history and say, oh, wow, okay, now I know what this is actually, a better understanding of history. But to understand, how has it affected me? Has it unearthed any kind of trauma in me that from things that I experienced growing up, things that were taught to me? Maybe think about, how have you experienced the stages of grief going through this learning process? When have you felt anger about the things you're learning? Have there been moments of denial? Have there been moments of depression where you think, oh, what are we supposed to do? This is just so big. So ask yourself those questions. I encourage you to do that, especially again, as this gets a little bit more up to date and maybe more personal for us as we're living this right now. But I wanna end with this prayer, and it's from a book called The Booklet of Uncommon Prayer, which was put together by a faith leader and an activist in the Black Lives Matter movement. His name's Kenji Kiramitsu, and this was with Evangelicals for Social Action, that organization. But this prayer is titled "For the End of White Supremacy." So let's pray. Healer God, whose church predates the doctrines of white supremacy by more than 1,000 years, empower us with words and wisdom to confront all racial divisions sown by colonizers and cultural elites. Teach us alongside all your saints to remember our people, all people in our bones, to stitch their hymns and heritage into our hearts. Help us each to reconnect with the cultural heritage that birthed us, instead of the violent racial categories into which we have been forced. Amen. So thank you all for joining us. Again, I'll stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes. But if you need to leave, thank you, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Oops. So I don't know if people are sticking around, if there's any particular questions or things that we didn't get a chance to talk about with the videos, if a thought or a question you had that you wanted to converse about or go a little bit more in depth about. We talked a little bit about sort of the relationship of church and faith and politics. I have some other questions here. So in this, Jamar.
Hello?
Oh yeah, Jerry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
If we're going to claim that Christianity is the answer, these problems. Maybe we need to examine what a Christian is, because the Bible, which we believe to be the inerrant word of God, still justifies, mostly in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well, the practice of slavery. And the Southern slave owners actually used the Bible to justify slavery, not to mention prejudice against gays. Homosexuals should be put to death, for example. You can beat your children. That's endorsed by the Bible. So, well, where do these ideas come from? And they haven't been completely abandoned, but maybe we need to examine this book that we think is perfect. Is that perfection? It's still part of the Christian Bible with which we were all raised.
Sure. Absolutely. And, I heard there's an author, Rachel Held Evans, who's written some fantastic books. And I don't remember the quote off the top of my head, but, she basically said, we can probably pull anything we want out of the Bible. If we have a position, we can probably find something in the Bible to justify it, which is what Jamar kind of talked about with, I forget which pastor it was, saying, well, there's nothing, prohibiting or endorsing segregation, but then he went to use particular passages in Scripture to endorse segregation. So if we want to find it, we can find it. But Rachel's her quote says that it's not so much what can we find in Scripture, but how are we approaching the Bible? And her thing is, we must approach it through a lens of love. We must figure out how to read and utilize and engage Scripture and the stories of Scripture through that particular lens. And how do we use it in ways that furthers love in the world, in our lives, in the church. So that's a very good point. And I think there are probably some theologians and writers who could probably help us do that. And a lot of them are probably, and I would say it, in regards to this conversation, non-white theologians and writers. But that's a very good point. How do we engage the Bible in this work? Yeah. Kathy, I saw your hand is up.
Sorry, took me
It's
a
all
while
right.
to unmute. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm just feeling really grateful for Westminster as a church, because over the past 10 years, it has been a very slow dawning epiphany, if you will, of learning and seeing the injustice of racism and just opening up all these issues. For me, it's been wonderful. And I guess you call that getting woke. But it's a slow process, and I think some other churches are not going through this, and I feel sad for them, and I'm just very grateful that our church is doing this. One thing that I wanted to say is, in the first video, that head of Christ, the white Jesus, that has been a pet peeve of mine ever since I was a little girl. And I always wondered why I didn't like that Jesus. And it's more of a pet peeve now than ever. It hangs in my dad's little church in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I'm just offended by it. And there's quite a few good videos on YouTube about white Jesus, if you ever have a chance to look at them. There's one by Ankos Films, ANKOS Films. There's a whole series called The White Jesus. It's really good.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that. I just wanted to say thank you, because I think this whole process for me started when we read One Summer Waking Up White a couple summers ago. And it's just like that kind of a moment for me.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a very conservative, family with a very sheltered. So anyways, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak for, the staff, and I think we're very grateful that there is at least a portion of our community who's willing to have these conversations. Yeah, and recognizing that, this certainly isn't all of Westminster, and there are probably folks who this might be a little uncomfortable for, but we're grateful that there is a portion of our community that's ready to have these conversations, and is willing to jump into them. And yeah, and like you said, this process is long term. The more I hear from activists and theologians who have been doing this work for a long time, the more I hear them say that this doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in a couple years. To fully let it sink in, it takes a long time. It can take decades, and that's why I wanted to ask those questions for people to consider, of not just what have you learned and what do you know now, but how does this now shape? How have maybe things I've learned about shaped who I am as a person, or who I am as a Christian, or who I am as a citizen in my neighborhood or a community? I think those are important questions to ask alongside, to really have that deep transformation that is, long term. And I do have that book. That book he's talking about is called The Color of Christ. It's a wonderful, I would say little, but it's not little. I think it's over almost 300 pages long. But it's just about how the image that we've had of Jesus throughout history has shaped our understandings of God, and how it's played a part in race in America and racism. Yeah. So one question or one quote I pulled from Jamar. He says, Christians do have a responsibility to consider how our political allegiances attach themselves to either support or deny racial justice. So the question I have with that, which I pulled from a leader's guide, is what do you believe are the consequences for Christians voting in favor of racist policies? Does that question sort of make sense? Like, what are some of the consequences have been the consequences of Christians voting and supporting racist policies? Kathy, did you have your hand up again?
I just think it gives Christianity a black eye. It's a bad witness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Susan. Sue.
It's very uncomfortable to think that Christians who do support and vote for policies and laws that enable racism truly believe somewhere in their heart and mind that what they're doing is the Christian thing. And that's really hard for me to get my arms around. In terms of myself, I think that some of the studies we have done and others have done have really helped me know that I do have a voice, not always so very articulate or getting across the real message I want to share, but I do have a voice and I do have a vote, and I'm one person. But there's an opportunity to speak in community with other people, and this large group here at Westminster just really gives me hope that there is this community and so many others that will sift through the dust and the muck and start seeing what it is that needs to be done. I hope that makes sense. But
yeah, and there is sifting to do. It's hard. I mean, as we kind of saw with the start of Lee Atwater, it's not we don't just throw all these racist terms around in, you know, in government, or, you know, things that, like, before the civil rights era, you could look and say, oh, that person uses those words and looks like this. We can, okay, that person is racist. There's more we have to sift through, because I think people recognize there are taboos and things that are not accepted. So we have to have maybe a more critical eye as Christians. Well, I mean, as citizens, but, you know, I think there's sort of an additional calling as Christians for if we say we worship and God and follow Jesus toward the kingdom of God. Yeah, we've got to be aware of things and yeah, participating. Yeah, Tom.
It's been wonderful listening to all you guys with your various comments. And Kathy, you mentioned the Solomon portrait of Christ, which was something, as I was reading these chapters, that I've been aware of the conflict with that particular portrait, but the way that it was stated in this book, it just really grabbed me emotionally. And it's something that has been a picture that my parents had up for a long time. And obviously, this was not just some sort of knowledge that I had conflicts with, but it's a deeply emotional thing that I hadn't realized I had about that particular thing. It's neat to hear, Susan, you say that you're not always that articulate about what your voice, but I thought you've been pretty articulate and spoke fairly well today. It's pretty interesting. And Nick, you were saying, where do we go from here? And I just think, and Chris was saying some of the same things, we got to be more critical. But it's a process, it's an everyday process that we're discovering things that just came to us as we grew up. Without a critical mind, we didn't have a critical mind throughout, you know, I didn't have a critical mind when I was 10 or something. And yet, so we need to learn this ability to be critical, especially with this voting stuff. It's just gotten us into such an amazingly difficult situation. And so, and one other thing that grabbed me, we haven't brought up at all, but that's the quotable king. And I think I'm very much a victim of just paying attention to the quotable king, because I don't really know some of the other things that he said. And I see him as a king, as a Gandhi, as just one of the great figures. But I think, wow, I really don't, I'm missing an awful lot about this guy, and we haven't had time to talk about it, but look forward to next week and more of the same.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, Betsy.
Okay, so I used to teach I taught in detention in Chester County Juvenile Detention, had most of the Coatesville kids, which were African-American. And then I also taught in a treatment center for adjudicated sex offenders. And most of those guys were also African-American. And I always took the month of February because it's just, you know, Black History Month, and that was convenient. But I always taught entirely something in that vein for the month. And one of the things I used was a film. It was a mini series on NBC in 1978. So, you know, it's an old one, but it was called King, and it starred Paul Winfield and Cicely Tyson as Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. And a very, very, very excellent portrayal if you can, you know, get it on some kind of, I don't know, streaming or something, if it's even still around. But it showed the humanity of Dr. King. And that was what I thought was really important. And when you're talking about, you know, just the quotable king, which I agree with, we've all heard all that stuff, but to see what his life was actually like in the struggles, he did not want to do this. He was really focused on being a pastor. That's what he wanted to do. That's what he trained to do. That's what he wanted to do. He had this baby. He didn't want to put himself in that position. And that was one of the things that came up. But because of his Christianity and recognition that this was something he needed to take a personal stance on. Paul Winfield does a fabulous portrayal of him, better than I've ever seen on any other program. So if you can get that, again, it's called King, and it was a mini series on NBC. The second thing I wanted to say is I think this idea of standing up personally is something to consider. Okay, because hey, I'm not, yeah, I can vote and I do vote, and I'm not a Republican anymore. I haven't been for a long time, and I do vote. I'm hearing all of the same stuff I heard, 50 years ago when I was a kid, all the rhetoric. Aren't you hearing that? The same kind of stuff, rationale when we were kids that we heard about racism and, the political stuff and, holding up the Bible in front of a church and blah, 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 all that stuff. And one of the things that I have really thought about is just taking it personally. Okay. And this is my example. My son-in-law, who's African-American, walks into a Turkey Hill. It's a white guy holding the door. My son-in-law says, "Thank you, sir." And the guy goes, "Huh." Okay. Now, as a white person, what do I do with that if I see it? Do I just go, not want to get involved? Don't want to deal with it? He's justified in saying that? Or do I stand on the side of my son-in-law and say, "Excuse me, sir, what did you mean by that?" Or help me understand what that was all about. That's what you got to do. That's the standing up personally and putting yourself at risk, because believe me, up here in Morgantown, let me tell you, we got a lot of big Trump trucks driving around still with stuff on them. Okay, so you got to be thinking about that. And where are you willing to put yourself? Where are you willing to stand with Christ and put yourself in that position? And that's significant. That's important. Okay.
I think I'll get to. Well, I guess people, if you guys can leave when you want. I want to make sure people don't feel like if you need to go, you can go. But yeah, I think that last thing you said, Betsy, even framing in the sense of like, how am I going to stand with Christ here? And in the sense of this person that I see, this thing has happened to, a personal encounter, that is Christ in front of me. How am I going to respond? So I think it's a beautiful way of putting that. And I know for me with I'm going back to the quotable king thing, but I remember the first time that kind of broke open for me was when I learned that before he was killed, he was preparing a sermon, and he was thinking, he had told his wife, I think it was, that he was thinking about titling it "America May Go to Hell." And I was wow, that's not the Dr. King I'd heard about. And I don't know if he ever began writing that sermon, but his daughter shared, it was like on the anniversary, I think, of his death some years ago, his daughter and son shared that. But it just broke open for me that, yeah, this is the nice quotes that I see all the time were not the full picture. And there was something more radical in a good way about him. Yeah, so I saw Kathy, and then I saw.
Thanks, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Jerry. Thanks for coming.
I just wanted to say that I agree with what Betsy said about standing up, but I have found, and this is new for me and it's very uncomfortable, that you get attacked. And as a white person to get attacked, it's like, what? But that's just my privilege. I never felt attacked before until I started posting Black Lives Matter on my Facebook page, and I got attacked quite a bit from evangelicals, white evangelical conservative Christian people who said, that's a Marxist movement. It's leaning towards communism, like you don't know what you're doing. And I said, yeah, I don't know where you get your information from. Let's talk, So I just wanted to say that it doesn't feel good, but that's okay. You will get attacked.
A couple more, and then I actually do have to log off, but I'm gonna go with Sue and then Carolyn to close out. So Sue,
Thank you. I wanted to mention that if you're ready to be, I think, galvanized to get skin in the game and be ready to take a stand, you might consider watching the PBS American Experience series on racism. And there is a one plus hour documentary on Emmett Till. And it is hugely important, in my opinion, to see that. The nation saw it and lived it, and I think it's something to see. Also, the Dick Cavett and James Baldwin interview, if you can YouTube that, it is astoundingly telling. There is a person who is a white guest who has a lot of advice to give to James Baldwin, and it so exposes the quote color blind, nothingness. And then also there's an interview in London with Muhammad Ali, and he speaks of the white Jesus in that interview. And I think that would be very interesting if you just Google Muhammad Ali interview, London, England, you'll find it.
Thanks, Sue. And then Carolyn, I wanted to get to you. Oh, Carolyn, I'm not sure if your audio is working. You're not muted, but I can't hear you at least. No, it's like you are muted, but
Is your volume turned down on your computer?
No, we
Yeah.
Unfortunately still can't. Let me see. See if I mute and then try unmuting Carolyn and see if that works. No.
No. Well.
Oh, now
there we go. We can hear you.
I've lost the picture, but that's okay. I just wanted to reinforce something that Betsy said. A friend of mine stores their RV out in Lancaster County and has said to me that she's extremely uncomfortable when she goes out there because of the number of Confederate flags that she has seen flying. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is the thing that I took away from what I was reading was a quote from Dr. King that I think is very fortuitous for us to think about. And that is, a riot is the language of the unheard. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to think about that, not only for what we're learning and what has taken place in the past, but for what situation we find ourselves in today. There are reasons why what's happening is happening, and we have to think about that and think about how our behavior can influence that and perhaps help to mitigate some of the current issues that we're facing in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we get to the not final chapter, but next to final chapter next week, we'll dive sort of into that with talking about a little bit more about the Black Lives Matter movement. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you the same time next week at 11:30.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the snowfall.
It is. It's snowing.
Snowing in Glen Mills.
Yeah.
Yeah, Exton too.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.